UNO has always been an expanding university, constantly moving forward. But as we move forward, we must also look back to where we began. Let's go back in time with the people who remember UNO the way it was. Join us for Reflections in Time.
Welcome to another Reflections in Time. It's a beautiful, warm summer day in almost the fall of 1989 here on our campus at UNO. And the tape you're visiting with us and watching by looking at it over at our library or over at our alumni house is part of a series we've come to know as Reflections in Time. And what I've tried to do over really a number of years now is visit with the really important things, I'd say, that relate to our University of Omaha and our University of Nebraska at Omaha, and that's the people. The people who have devoted so much of their lives, sometimes 30 and 40 years, to this institution in their work life. And we've been acquiring a lot of interesting videotapes. Today is no exception, but it's just a little different. I'm going to visit with a gentleman who has been on our campus a number of years, but who is far from finished in terms of the time he's working with this university. I'm talking about our Chancellor, Del Weber. And I asked the Chancellor to come by on this nice summer day and visit with us about some things I've not heard about him and a lot of other people, and put something in our archives, and then we'll come back and do chapter 2 later on. Del, it's nice to have you with us.
Paul, thank you. It's nice to be here. It's nice to kind of reflect on who you are and what's happened in 57 years.
Yeah. Now in your case, your background, I know that part, didn't start very far from where we're sitting here today. You're a Nebraska boy, aren't you?
I'm a Nebraska boy. I grew up in Columbus, and in the height of the Depression, 1932.
Live in town or in the country?
Lived in town. My father was a farmer, and Dad actually lost his farm.
As many people did in those days.
His father was a homesteader, as was his mother, and as was my mother on the maternal side. So they were old-line Nebraska farmers, having come here from Illinois and from Germany in the middle 1800s.
Oh, yeah.
And Dad was the youngest of 6 boys, 2 of whom became ministers.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, and my father was the youngest, and so he never learned to farm. The reason he never learned to farm was because, as the youngest, he had to help his mother with the cooking. So he was not prepared to become a farmer, and given the tough years of the Depression and his own lack of ability as a farmer, he lost the farm during the Depression and then came to town. So I'm a product of the Depression, and you know, I've often thought about that. You think of coming from a poor family, and it was a poor family, but it wasn't poor in the sense I think that we think of it now, because it was far different.
Poor had a different connotation then,
Absolutely, didn't it? Because everyone was poor. You know, the downtown merchant was considered to be fairly wealthy as you thought about it. That's something, by the way, that's changed a great deal, because we don't think of Main Street merchants as being particularly wealthy. They're struggling. They probably were in those days. But they had a cash flow, and so you thought of them as fairly wealthy. But everyone was suffering in one way or the other during the Depression years. And so as you played with your playmates and you saw your father and mother's friends, none of them had very much money. It, in a sense, was the Norman Rockwell time of this country.
Yeah.
So that you were poor in some ways, but certainly not poor in spirit. It was an intact family. It was a family where you had an extended family. Lots of uncles and aunts and cousins.
Fairly close by?
Yes. And farming, you know, maybe within a radius of 20 miles. And one of the fond memories I have of that is almost every Sunday, my 5 uncles and my father would gather with their children and their wives over at my grandfather's home in Columbus. And we would go over, we would have lunch, and you would sit and visit. There was no television.
They called it dinner in those days, didn't they?
Yes, they called it dinner, absolutely. It was dinner, and we sat around, and the older people would visit, and the youngsters would be out in the yard playing, doing one thing or the other. And I remember one of the vivid memories is at about 4 o'clock, every Sunday, my grandfather would say, "It's time for prayer." And he had this chair, this easy chair that was his chair. And I remember it had the spittoon on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
And when he would say it was time for prayer, here were 6 strapping adult men, and they got to their knees. And there was no grousing about it, nothing else. My grandfather would turn around and get down on his knees, and he would rest his elbows on this chair. And above him was a huge picture of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And he would pray. And you know, in retrospect, I don't know how long those prayers were, but to a young boy, it seemed to me they were at least 20 minutes. And they went on and on and on. It was a wonderful time.
But at the time, you didn't forget, as a squirmy little boy.
Yes, that's right.
Sounds like you had family reunions nearly every weekend.
Every weekend, and then of course you really had the extended family once a year when you met in the park, and everyone came from miles around for an extended family reunion.
Why was it that people did so much of that in those days, 20, 30 years ago? I don't think we get so much of it. People are spread out more now,
yes.
Yeah. But that family weekend, Sunday afternoon together, that's sort of a thing of the past, isn't it?
It really is, I think. Although my family, the Weber family, still meets annually in Geneseo, Illinois.
So you still have a one-year thing?
Yes. Well, I've never gone to it, you know, but that's the extended family. Again, these are people who are really Weber descendants and maybe removed 8, 9 times from me, but that is still an extended family tradition.
Yeah. Nice tradition.
So, yes.
How was it as a young boy or growing up in a modest-sized town? Any remembrances of that? Good stories, schools, whatever? Start any place you like there.
Yes. Well, I should probably start with my mother. Well, let me tell you a little bit first about my father, and then talk a little bit about mother.
Mm-hmm.
But my dad, of course, came into town. He was what was known in those days as a common laborer. You probably remember the term.
You bet.
You don't hear that term anymore, but what it meant was he had no skills. And so he came into the city of Columbus, and he began to work for a coal company there, and then worked for a grocery store. Later, as I grew up, he was a Maytag repairman. And it was pretty much, as I remember, from job to job, trying to, you know, hold the family together. He finally worked for the WPA. You remember that?
Yes,
and,
Works Progress Administration.
Yes. And, you know, there was a great deal of fun made of WPA because you remember the cartoons about the WPA workers who were leaning on the shovel.
Yeah.
And I've often thought about that because anyone who laughs about that has never dug a ditch. But if you dig a ditch, you need to rest fairly frequently on that shovel.
It's hard work.
Difficult work. And one of the things about my father that I'll always remember, and when you think about trying to hold a family together, is that you had to go where the work was at with the WPA. And so we went, my father, there was a job to be done in Seward, Nebraska, which was 50 miles away from Columbus. So my father would hitchhike to Seward on Sunday, would stay on the courthouse lawn in Seward on a pup tent during the week, and then come back on the weekend to Columbus. And that's,
wow.
You know, those were tough, tough days. And so that we really did not come out of that kind of job-to-job existence until about 1942, when my father, when the Meade Ordnance Plant opened up.
Oh.
And we moved to a little place in Nebraska called Memphis for the summer, and my dad, I remember, was paid $1.65 an hour.
Pretty good wage at that time.
It was wonderful.
Very good.
It was like a new era had opened. I spent then the 5th grade in Wahoo, Nebraska, and then finally back to Columbus. We did other things. I remember one of the things I remember was my dad and my mother. I guess you would look at them today in this experience as itinerant farm workers, because I remember one summer or 2 summers that we did this, where the peaches were ripening in Grand Junction, Colorado, and Fruita, Colorado, in that area, western Colorado. And I remember driving out there and picking peaches. I didn't, I was too young, but I can remember my mother and my father and my oldest brother picking peaches, and that's how we made the money in the summer.
Where did you stay then? Did you have a tent then, or how did you live?
No, oh no, we didn't. No, they, Mom and Dad would get a small apartment or a place to stay, you know, during that period of time. And I remember how we got there. My father had a 1930 Model A.
Good car.
Yes, but this car didn't have any rings in it. And, you know, you remember that was in the day before the hydraulic lifts. If you went into a station, they had oil pits.
Yes.
You know, actually a hole where the man would go down in the hole. You'd drive the car over, you'd loosen the petcock, and that's how you'd drain the oil.
Yes.
My dad, we didn't have any money, and that car would go through so much oil that my dad would stop about every 50 miles. He'd go over into the station. They'd give him the used oil. He'd pour that into the car, and we'd keep going.
I know what you're saying. We had a hired man that would use the same thing,
yes.
Used oil.
Yes. I never thought anything about it.
No.
That's just the way life was. Well, anyway, that was kind of, but my mother was the linchpin. My mother was so if my father, I don't wish to demean my father, I don't mean that, but my mother was the linchpin. She was the person who really held that family together, because she, first of all, she was a wonderful Christian woman, and but she also just simply knew how to manage, and she made soap. She baked every day. And I was telling you about these Sundays when we would go over to my uncle's. And I remember that being such a joy, because he had what we called boughten bread.
Wow, store bread.
Oh, and it was wonderful. Today I can't stand it. And you know, if my mother only were here to bake every day, I'd love it.
I used to think that crummy store bread was so great too.
I know it. And it's so bad.
Yeah, and now we didn't know how good we had it, but Mother held the place together. Sounds like, you know, that you had a very happy home. You had your problem, but that you had a happy home.
It was, and it was a happy home. I had an older sister and 2 older brothers, and it was fun. And we all worked hard. I remember we had a victory garden during the war, and that wasn't fun, getting out in humid August in Nebraska to garden that and hoe the weeds and that type of thing. But we did a lot of things. You know, I can remember I used to have a red flyer wagon.
Oh, they were great.
Yeah, and my mother would make kolaches, rolls of various types, and she used to make potholders. And I would take those out and sell them. And that's how my mother made some dollars and money. So I was a salesman at a very young age.
Yeah, and every little bit helped, didn't it?
Oh,
and those bits were little.
Yes, they really were.
But you learned to work at an early age, didn't you?
You learned to work, and you played hard and you worked hard. And I think it served us well.
They say that you were pretty well formed by the time we're 5.
Yeah.
A lot of your basic philosophy probably came to you in those very early years, didn't it?
Yes, I think it really did, and it stays with you. You know, you really, I think, are grateful for what you have because of what you didn't have when you started. I can remember that we never had a refrigerator until I was in the 5th grade. I don't know that that was so unusual, but it was the ice box.
You bet.
You can remember the iceman coming every day. And
a card in the window that told him how many pounds?
Yes. But the problem was, if you couldn't afford the ice, which we couldn't, a lot of days that ice box was, it was hot rather than cold, and you had rancid butter and the smells of that type of thing. So it was wonderful to get a refrigerator where everything was cool, and I can remember the experience of biting into the first orange that I'd ever had cold.
Is that?
Yeah, and I remember that. It was such a wonderful kind
little
of thing.
things are what life's made up of, really.
Yes, that's right.
Well, now how about getting away from family for just a little bit and then back to your own growing family a little later, perhaps still. How about school? You got going at that.
Yes.
Where you've been much of your life since.
Yes, that's right. Well, I started out as all youngsters do, I guess, in a neighborhood elementary school called Third Ward. You know, we really think of that more as
innovative title.
Yeah, we think of that more associated with politics
Yeah.
when you think about wards, but it was called Third Ward. It was about 4 or 5 blocks to school, and I went to school there for the first 6 years of my life. And I remember, the teachers I had, and I remember them as being so beautiful, particularly a first grade and a third grade teacher that I had. And years later, after I had been out of school and was now teaching at the Arizona State University, I came back to my hometown, and I was talking with my mother one day, and I said, I remember Miss Wilkinson so much. I said, I'd sure like to see her. And she said, well, she's still living over here in an apartment. I said, I'm going to go over and talk with her. So I walked in, and she pretended to remember me. But she was as beautiful as I remembered her. And so I said to her, it isn't, I thought you were beautiful when I was in the first grade, but I said, you still are. Why didn't you ever get married? And she said, in those days you never got married. You committed yourself either to teaching as a career if you were a woman, or getting married, but you didn't do both. And
interesting.
So going to school was I was not an outstanding student in any sense. I was always a good student, but not an outstanding student.
Did you like school?
Liked school. Always had a curious mind about things. And I liked the kind of things that went with school, the kind of activities you engaged in, the sandlot games and all of those kind of things. And yes, I liked school very much. And I was always involved in school in a lot of different kind of activities.
Right on up through high school
Yes.
and right there in
Yes,
Columbus.
right.
Did you come out of a family that generally went to college, or how was it that you ended up at Midland?
No, I did not. It's interesting because my mother and father, both had around a 6th grade education. But they always had a great sensitivity to education. And that was a very important credo with them. They wanted every one of their children to have at least a high school education. With the, particularly with the two older, my sister and older brother, they were not able to go to college. I can remember in 1940 when my brother wanted very much to go into the ministry and going to Midland College and hoping to find enough aid, etc., and assistance to be able to do that. But they simply were not able to do it. And I'm not sure that my sister even ever contemplated going to college, because it was simply not in the cards. There was not the money. When I came along, my mother was insistent that I go to college. But it was not a matter that we spent a great deal of time looking at colleges or anything like you would do today. Mine was much more a matter of the last month or so of my high school days, my mother saying to me that she wanted me to go to college. And so I began to look at Midland College and the University of Nebraska, and I decided to go to Midland College because, frankly, it was on Highway 30. It was 50 miles away, and I could hitchhike it.
Sure.
And if you looked at the college expenses, I knew I had to get home on the weekends to, at that time, thinking about part-time work, to get my laundry done, to eat at home. And so for the first 2 years, every weekend I hitchhiked between Fremont and Columbus, went home to work or to do whatever.
On old Highway 30.
Yes. And so my mother went to work. She had always been in the home, but she went to work at a hotel in Columbus, Hotel Evans, as a cook, in order to save $300 so I could go to Midland College. And I went the first semester. In those years there was no federal aid, and I wasn't going to earn a scholarship with my high school record, and I was not an athlete of any consequence. So I went to Midland, paid the $300, which is what it cost for the first semester. The second semester, I went into a man by the name of Elmer Sass, who was the college business administrator, and he had just retired about 2 years ago from Midland. Explained the situation to him and really just pleaded with him that he let me go on with no money and that I would then work in the summer and pay him back. And it was an embarrassing situation, but he finally said yes, he would do that. And so I went to school at Midland without having any money the second semester. Then after the end of that first year, I began to work, and you see all over Nebraska these grain elevators.
Yep.
Well, I wheelbarrowed cement for Wagner Mills.
That's a way to get in shape.
Yeah, that was it. And you know, I was a 150-pounder wheelbarrowing cement all summer long. But it was good salary, and so I earned enough to pay that off and then start the next semester. And then a very fortuitous thing happened because I was approached by Jewel Tea. My brother had worked for Jewel Tea, and I was approached by them asking me whether I would be interested in running what they called their summer routes. And what this was I simply went from Harlan, Iowa to Atlantic to Grand Island to Lincoln, and I ran the routes for the men who were leaving to go on a vacation for 2 weeks.
You were vacation relief.
That's right. So that's a better way to put it. I was vacation relief, and so I spent my summer in the Nebraska-Iowa area. And I did that, and I won a scholarship for $200
From
Jewel Tea.
Is that?
That was a lot of money in those days.
That plus the money you made.
That's it. So that I had that job then from the rest of the time I was at Midland. And that, along with being the advertising manager of the yearbook and of the newspaper, school newspaper, plus working at Hormel's on the weekends or any time I could, I really ended up in good financial shape in my last 2 years of college.
When in the world did you find time to have any social life at all with all that activity?
I didn't really have a great deal of social life at Midland. I was in a fraternity, which was a local, now a national fraternity there. I was a debater. We had an excellent debate team. But in terms of being a social animal, I really wasn't.
But you did
I wasn't
find time
denied, by the way.
You did find time to find a young lady that
Yes.
has spent a lot of her life with you.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that was very fortuitous for me, because we had been high school sweethearts, and that was one of those off again, on again kind of things, and I chased her long enough until she finally caught me. And it's been a great 35 years with her, because she's kind of the unsung hero. Luann is a kind of a person who really has chosen to be a wife and to be the person kind of who really pushes and in a nice way, not in an aggressive way, but she's always been there. She's taken care of the family, and she's been kind of, in a sense, for my generation like my mother was for mine.
As you described her, she reminded me of your mother, as
Yes.
you had mentioned
Yeah.
her a little while ago.
Yeah.
So
I was kidding Luann the other night. I said, I was telling a couple, in fact, just last night, I was telling a couple, I said, when we were talking about how poor we were when we were first married, and I said, if it had not been for Luann, we would not have made it, because I said she watched every buck. I said she's forgotten how now, but she's making up for it. But at the time, she watched every dollar there was.
Yeah.
So it was great.
now, college sounded like a good but a rather difficult experience in terms of long, hard hours off campus and on. But you evidently liked school and decided, as life went along, as I've looked over your vita, to sort of keep at it.
Yes. Well, yes, it wasn't that straightforward, though. I of course, graduated from Midland in '54,
Mm-hmm.
and I had a postponement from the Korean War. And when I graduated, I immediately volunteered for the draft, because I knew, well, I didn't know. I might have avoided the draft by simply because I was in a rank order list, but I really wanted to get on with whatever career it was I was going to choose, and so I volunteered for the the service, and spent 2 years. And as fortune would have it, I think it was one of the confidence builders in my life.
Was it?
One of the first ones. I think that maybe serving as a debater also was, but but the second one was a service, and for this reason, I went into the service and did my basic at Fort Bliss, and one day, just out of the blue, the battalion sergeant came to me and said, "We want you to report over to headquarters company." And I said, what about? And he said, "Well, I don't know, they want you over there." So I went over there and I sat down, and the man said to me, "We want you to consider coming into counterintelligence. You've been selected." And they had selected 6 people out of this battalion. And I said, "What's that all about? I mean, counterintelligence, I didn't know anything about it." And so he gave me this big song and dance about I would be in a trench coat, and I might be flown behind enemy lines, and all of this.
This sounded exciting.
So anyways, the first thing we have to do is give you an English test, see whether you can pass that. So they gave me an English test, and it seemed to me like that was a breeze. And when it finished, I had 70% on it, which was passing. I mean, that was it. But at any rate, when I finished basic, they then flew me back to Fort Dundalk, Maryland, which was Fort Holabird. Now that later became the light minimum security prison that housed Charles Colson and some of the Watergate conspirators. But at that time, that was where they trained people in counterintelligence. And it was a very intensive training. And depending on how you did in interviews, where they really put you to the test, you could either end up in the B school, which is where I ended up, or in the C school. And if you ended up in the C school, you really became a clerk typist kind of thing. And if you became the B, you became the special investigator, the person with the badge and all of this who went out and did the investigatorial work. The fact that I was, well, out of that 6 that they called out of that battalion, they only selected 2 eventually. And of that 2 who went to Fort Holabird, 1 ended up in the B school.
That was you?
That was me. And that was a confidence builder.
Sure.
It told me something that I really had not sensed before. So I spent 2 years then in counterintelligence.
Wearing that trench coat?
Yes. Well, not quite the trench coat, but it wasn't that romantic. But it was interesting because I never wore a uniform all the years I was in the service. Because I was a civilian and no one knew what my rank was or anything else. I was a lonely SP3 or a corporal, but no one knew that. But I came out of the service and I came back to Nebraska. And I went to Midland College, told them I wanted to be in Nebraska and I wanted to do something. And a man at Midland College put me in touch with Howard Buffett, who at that time was located in the Omaha National Bank here in Omaha. And I went up to see him, and he was a nice man. And he got for me 2 job interviews. One was with Swift and Company. The other was with Northwestern Bell. I was offered both those jobs. To come to work in the Northwestern Bell management program and then in the Swift program. So I went back to my hometown, and I also was offered a job with Balin Manufacturing Company. At that time, Balin was really booming.
Big. They built all those grain things around home and corn cribs and everything.
Yes, and I talked with Walt Balin, who was the founder and owner of the company, about a sales job, and he told me that he had a sales job that I might be interested in. It was going to pay over $10,000, which was, just a horrendous amount of money.
Yeah.
But I had this feeling that I wanted to teach, and that's what I eventually did. I went to a small town 20 miles north of Columbus and began teaching.
Not for $10,000 a year either.
No, for $3,600. And I served as the teacher and the principal of that school.
Did you?
And there were 40 kids in high school, grades 9 through 12. And it was a wonderful experience, and I still see some of those youngsters, and well, they're my age now, but because I was only 4 or 5 years older than they were, but we had great times there. We had, Luann and I were married, and we lived in an apartment there for $50 a month, and we moved into that apartment And when we moved in, we had to clear the birds out. I mean, this was an attic kind of a thing. Had to clear the birds out and clean that all up. But that's where we had our first child, our son. And those were good years. But the problem was that at $3,600 and then the second year, $3,800, we were taking money out of the bank rather than putting it in. Money that we had saved earlier when, you know. So we looked at it, and I said, you know, we got to do something. If I'm going to stay in this field, then I've got to figure out a way. So,
but you wanted to stay in teaching.
Yes, I wanted to stay in teaching. So the superintendent of schools there said, why don't you go back to the University of Nebraska? It was the University of Nebraska, Lincoln now. It was called the University of Nebraska then. And he said, you know, I think you can get a stipend as a graduate assistant for $900. Well, you see, I had $160 a month coming from the GI Bill, $900 from the university plus tuition. I got to figure out, my take-home pay was $254. I could go to school for $250 in Nebraska, at UNL, and so I decided, let's go back to school and get a master's degree.
So practically the same income you had as an administrator and as a teacher.
That's right. Yeah. So we went to UNL, and I stayed at we stayed at a place called Huskerville, which was the old Lincoln Air Force Hospital barracks.
Yeah.
And again, $50 a month, and they provided all the utilities and all of that. And again, some interesting kinds of things began to happen as we were there. First of all, I thought I was going back to work on a master's in history. And that tells you how naive I was about graduate education and the whole business. I wasn't doing that at all. I found out I was going to be working on a master's degree in education, which was fine. I spent a year there, just simply as a graduate assistant. And one day, the principal of university school, they used to have a university lab school.
I remember that.
Came to me and said, you know, I wonder if you'd be interested in coming over to the lab school as the principal of the junior high school. I said, well, I don't know whether I would or not. He said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll pay you $6,000 a year. I couldn't believe it, you know, because so here I was making $6,000 a year plus my GI Bill, going to school, working.
The best income you'd ever had.
Ever had. I mean, it was, again, like we were sitting, you know, just unbelievably wealthy. So I stayed there and did that the rest of the time. I was only going to stay one more year and then leave and go back out into the Nebraska schools as
with your master's degree.
And I guess a second confidence builder happened. 2 or 3 of the professors got a hold of me and said, look, you don't want to do that. You want to get your doctorate. Can't believe you. I don't want to get a doctorate. Yeah, that's what you want to do. And they had some confidence in me, and so I stayed and got the doctorate. One day, one of the professors came to me and he said, Del, he said, I've just come back to UNL. I've been the head of Compton's Encyclopedia, their force in Chicago, and I'm just starting back here again, and I want you to become my doctoral student. And I said, well, I've already got a doctoral advisor. He said, that doesn't make any difference. He said, I'll take care of it. And he did. And that was another break, because he was a man of a great, he was a great confidence builder again. I remember going to him at days when I was really down and didn't know what to do next, and he would simply sit and talk as we're talking. When you left, all your problems were solved. He hadn't solved anything, but he he made you feel like you could do this.
Got you on the road again.
The interesting thing is that man finished 2 doctoral students at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. One was me, the other was Gene Budig, who is now the Chancellor at the University of Kansas.
Yeah.
That was it. Those are the only 2 that he ever finished.
Is very interesting.
He simply picked and selected who he wanted to work with.
So he was a real help to you.
He really was. So, of course, then I got the doctorate there and left. And well, I wanted to really stay at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and I had a job offer to stay there. And this same advisor said to me, look, you either leave here or I'll make sure that you don't have much of a future. And he was a powerful man.
Why did he say that, do you think?
He really felt that, I think he said it for two reasons. I think he felt at that time that the college was already inbred too much with its own graduates. And I think he felt for me that if I stayed, I would always simply be another graduate student there.
Mm-hmm. And
he was absolutely correct. You know, I did not want to leave Nebraska at the time, but when I think about it, it was advice par excellence. I mean, there simply was. I would have been an also-ran staying there, and you would have been fighting that image of always having been one of the students.
Sure.
So it was better for me to.
The advice was good, and where did you and Luann and the rest of your family, one son by now?
Yes.
You headed off to?
Well, we had now a daughter also.
Oh,
okay.
Yes,
we had a daughter, second child. I might tell you, just if I might divert talking about the second child for a moment. I've always felt that there have been crucial times in my life when the Lord has really watched after me. And I could give you instance after instance, but that's one. During the summers, at that time I was working for Midland Manufacturing, and they always had a bonus. And when Beth, our daughter, came along, the hospital bill was $125. Now that was a lot of money. I mean, today it's peanuts, you know, for what it cost.
But then it was a hunk of money.
And we didn't have $125, and we didn't know how we were going to save $125. And about the day after she was born, I went to the mailbox. Here's a bonus check from Balin's that I didn't know I was going to get, and it was for $125.
Right on the nose.
Right on the nose. Yeah, so it's amazing. Well, so after that, we packed up those two children and we went to Arizona. I might talk about that for a moment because it tells you the difference between the system then and the system now. We operate under a set of regulations now called affirmative action.
Yeah.
Both regulations and intent, and I think it's very good. But it has changed the system a great deal because when I graduated from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, my advisor simply picked up the phone and he called his contacts around the country. He said, I've got this guy, Del Weber, and I think he could, if you're looking for someone, could be very good. So he called a man at the University of Arizona, and I was to fly down and be interviewed in Tucson. And the week before that was to happen, the dean of the College of Education called and said, look, he said, I'd like very much to have you come, but we have so many Nebraskans now in our College of Education that I just came from a meeting with the president, and the president said no more. So he said, what I've done though is I've called a man at Arizona State University, and he said they want to interview you. And I thought, sure, you know, I'll wait for that call forever. But no, the call came. I went to Phoenix. I was hired. And again, you'll see in a minute how the fortune began to take hold here. But I went there as an assistant professor. This was in 1962. And I remember thinking, you know, here I had just conquered that doctorate. And now life would be easier. And I found life was really tough because I had 4 classes to prepare for.
Now, had you had any teaching background, really?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'd had teaching background.
At UNL?
Yes. Yes, but not a whole lot. I mean, you know, as a teaching assistant and that kind of thing. But I had 4 classes to prepare for, and I never slept. I had a very bad case of insomnia. It's the only time in my life I ever have. I could not sleep at night because I was trying to stay ahead of those 4 classes, you know. It was very difficult. But and about Christmas time of that year, I remember saying to Luann, if this is the way it's going to be, I'm going to get out of this. It's just too tough. I mean, well, as you well know, having been through that, it straightens out. But one evening, I was reading Time magazine, and I flipped to the section on education, and there was a story there about a man by the name of Harry Newbern, who had been the first president of public television in this country, also the first president, or a president of the University of Oregon during the late 40s, and now the president of the University of Montana. He had become embroiled in a controversy with his Board of Regents in Montana over how higher education should be organized. And the gist of the story was that he had resigned and he was coming to Arizona State University to head up a new Center for Higher Education. So New Bern came to Arizona, and I said to Luann as I read that article, I said, you know, I'm going to sit in on this man's classes because I want to learn what, you know, how a man like that thinks. It was one of those fortuitous kind of things. And so I simply sat in his classes. He couldn't believe that a young assistant professor would want to sit in his classes, but I did. And we struck up a very close friendship. After he had been at Arizona for about 2-3 years, he was offered he was doing some consulting at a new university in Cleveland, Ohio called Cleveland State University. And they had asked him to come back there about once a week. So he asked me if I would be willing to teach his classes while he was going back to Cleveland. I said yes, I would do that. And finally, they asked him to come back as the interim president for a year. So he came to me one day and said, Del, would you go with me as my assistant? And I think it's the only time I've never consulted with Luann about doing anything. I simply said, yes, I'll do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I went home and I told Luann, we're going to Cleveland. Now what made that so tough is that we had a 5-week-old third child now.
Now you had your full complement of family, huh?
Yes. And an old car, and so we packed up the old car and a U-Haul and took a ice box full of milk, and with 3 children headed off to Ohio.
What year was this?
This was in '65.
65.
But he was the second then mentor in my life. The first being my doctoral advisor, then this man.
Mm-hmm.
We got to Cleveland. I worked with him for 4 years. And we were the closest of friends, but the day I walked into the office for the first time, I said to him, what do you want me to call you? It was an honest question because I didn't know. He said, you can either call me President New Bern, Mr. President, or Dr. New Bern. That was it. I looked at him and I said, are you serious? And he said, I'm absolutely serious. You know, that he was telling me he had a role to fill, and that's how he was going to fill it. And so we worked together there for a year. He went back to Arizona. Am I getting too detailed, Paul?
No,
okay.
This is great.
All right. He went back to Arizona, and I stayed on with a man who was then hired as the president by the name of Harold Enerson. And I served as his assistant for 3 years. Harold Enerson later became the president of Ohio State University. He was the man who fired Woody Hayes, the whole business. During those 4 years at Cleveland State, Harry New Bern, the man I'd gone there with, this mentor, kept wanting me to come back to Arizona. And I remember he called me one time and he said, Del, will you meet me in Chicago? I need to talk to you. And so I sat and talked with him in a hotel room in Chicago. He said, I want you to come back to work in my Center for Higher Education. I said, you know, I don't want to do that. I said, I'm really having too much fun in Cleveland. He said, you're making a mistake. He said, you really need to get back and work with me. I said, well, I'm not ready to do that. 2 years later, he called again. He said, can you meet me in Chicago? I said, yes. He said, I want you to come back now to Arizona. By this time, he is now the dean of the College of Education, and through a series of circumstances. And so he wants me to come back as his associate dean. And I said, well, what will you pay? He said, I will pay you, I think the salary was $20,000. I said, Harry, I said, I'm making $22,300 now in Cleveland. Why would I come back there for $2,200 less than I'm making now? He said, because it's the right thing to do. If you stay in Cleveland, you will be typed as an assistant to the president. You don't want that. You want to come back here and work with me. So I said, well, I'll think about it. And as I left, he said, promise me one thing, that you won't make this decision based on money. I said, I won't. So I went back, talked with Luann, went in to see Harold Anderson, who was my third mentor. Said, Harold, I'm going to go back to Arizona. I said, why? And I said, oh, I just think it's time to move. He said, well, Del, you know, you're paid a good salary here, and I'm not going to pay you any more. He thought I was really angling for a raise. I said, no, I'm actually taking a $2,300 cut to go back to Arizona. He said, I've never heard of that before. I said, well, I think it's the right thing to do. I went back to Arizona. The day I walked into the office and signed the contract, he had paid me the same amount of money I was getting in Cleveland. No more, but he had upped the salary. He was testing me.
Uh-huh. So you came for something other than the financial end of it, and that's what he wanted.
Yes.
Why did you make that decision?
That's right. And again, fortune smiled, because I was back as his associate dean no more than 2 weeks when the president of the university resigned, and they asked him to become the interim president. And he then asked me to become the interim dean of the college.
Your timing was just about perfect.
It was. So I served as interim dean, and they began the search for a new president, or for a new dean. And they had a committee of 13 people who began this search. And it came down after a long period of time to 2 people, me and an outsider. The chairman of the committee, and the vote, there was one person missing, and the vote came down to a tie between me and the other person, 6-6. They called the 13th person, who happened to be the associate dean of liberal arts, and he said, I won't make that decision. I'm not going to be, in effect, the person who chooses the dean of the College of Education. So the chairman of the committee took this to the president and said, Mr. President, here are 2 choices, and we're tied, and you select who you want, thinking that the president, being a good friend of mine, would choose me. The president said, no, I won't do that. You go back and do your work. I told you to bring me a candidate. Well, they finally voted and voted me into the position. But it tells you so much about his character.
Yes,
he simply would not, he was not going to be accused of bias or favoritism. I mean, he wanted me in the job, I'm sure, but he wasn't going to do that way.
Interesting.
Yeah.
This man really played a large part in your life through all those years, Cleveland and Tempe and back again. And
it really did, and he was a man of great integrity, a man of high principle, the man you hear about where they threw the pattern away, and he really was one of the old line. Interestingly enough, he and Milo Bale were at Iowa University together.
Well, maybe some things rubbed off on each other there,
yes,
the type we had here some years ago.
Yes, they did know each other there.
Well, now you were well settled. You had a fine position there at the university at Arizona State, and settled in. You had your family and a good place and a good salary, as you were describing as you began. What on earth caused you to make another move?
That's a interesting question, because I was not looking for a position. I mean, I was not in the job market as such. And yet I had an uneasy feeling. You see, I was really a young dean. I had gone there, I had become dean in '69, and at that time I would have been 37. And I'd now been there 9 years. And that college had blossomed. It had been chosen by the American Council on Education as one of the top 30 schools in the country. And the American Council also said that in the next decade it would probably become the #1 school. And I had really started to reach the place, looking at myself, I was 45 years old and saying, wait a minute now, I've got 20 years of work life. Do I want to spend them here, or what am I going to do? My mother had always been sending to me the clippings about higher education in Nebraska, not just about UNO, but just has been sending these clippings. And I had read about the shakeup, and or not the shakeup, but about the president going to Lincoln, and then I'd also picked up through professional journals the advertisement that they were looking for a chancellor at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. And on the last day of that search, I decided that I was going to throw my hat in the ring. And so I called Dale Tukulski, who was the chairman of the search committee and at that time was the vice chairman of Enron, or Internorth. And I said, I can't get a letter in today, but will this call suffice of my intent, and then I will follow it up with a letter? And he said, oh, sure, that's fine. And that's what happened. Then I came here for interviews and came to the campus. Yeah.
Well, you know, you probably won't believe this, but we've already visited for just about an hour. And we've only covered...
I've talked a lot.
Yes, and that's what I wanted you to do. And you have told us so much in the way of interest in influential people, family, friends, professional people, and the growth and change of your own family. And I think this would be an appropriate place to help for us to end this first tape. And then we'll pick it up later this fall when you have an hour and do another hour on coming to the university and move on into that sort of thing.
Yes, fine.
And for all our friends who have been sitting watching us over at the Alumni House or the library, we want to thank you for that, listening to this interesting background of our current Chancellor here in 1989 of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. We thank him, and we thank every one of you too for joining us for another what we refer to as Reflections in Time.